Good morning, everybody. Please take a seat. We are going to start. Yesterday, maybe you remember, we had an interface, a workshop about the interface between science and policy, understanding differences. Where does our science come into policy-making cycles, etc., etc.? Today, we have a triangle dialogue. It's better, even 3 triangle dialogues. One about carbon sequestration, one about monitoring soil health, and one about sustainable soil management. It is my goal to listen very carefully to the presenters and also to the debates, because what we aim at is for November of this year to have a huge discussion about the elephants in the room. What are the bigger problems that would help us, or what are the bigger approaches, possible approaches to help forward implementing our toolbox, or prevent from it being operational in practice. So it's quite a goal for today. We have, I give the floor immediately to David Wall, because you are the moderator of the first theme, that is carbon sequestration. David, please.
Thank you, Grieth. So as outlined, we're going to start with carbon sequestration first up this morning. We have a panel for the discussion, and Christian Holzleiter will start the day, and I suppose preface the discussion with the policy context, and I think that's important to set the scene. Following that, we'll have a couple of presentations from EJP Soil, scientific presentations, and then we'll call on for Fernando Moyano to give a reflection from a farmer's perspective, which I think is important in this whole discussion. So it makes for a really good discussion. I think this morning I'm really looking forward to it, and I would now call on Christian to take the floor and give us your reflections. Thank you.
Good morning. Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. Very happy to be here and to tell you a bit what's happening now in Brussels, what we are discussing from the policy side, and of course I'm coming a bit more from the climate side of the house, but I think you need to have a holistic view on agriculture, and I'll come several times back to the topic of sustainability overall. from a climate perspective, we have this big objective for 2050 to become climate neutral. So this means, on balance, we shouldn't add any more CO2 to the atmosphere. So for this, we need to reduce our emissions very rapidly, very significantly. But we also need to get better at taking CO2 actively out of the atmosphere, storing it in our forests, in our soils, the products that we produce out of biomass, like wooden buildings, and a certain share of the CO2 we also need to put back from where we've taken the carbon initially, so the empty gas fields of the North Sea. So when we look towards 2040, 2050, the bioeconomy becomes much more important than today, because we'll still need food. We'll still need also biogenic carbon for energy production, but we'll need it more for as a feedstock for the chemical, for the construction sector. So the demand on our land will increase what we want from our land, because we have less fossil carbon, and this we need to substitute, or even zero fossil carbon, with biogenic carbon or carbon that we directly get out of the atmosphere. So the health of our soils, the health of our forests will be essential for our economy in 2040, 2050, even more so than today. And this is why, from a climate perspective, here comes the interest in a sustainable and resilient agriculture and forestry. We need to produce in the future our food, our feedstocks, our biogenic carbon, the animal proteins, the plant-based proteins, in a more sustainable way. So this means for us with less emissions and more carbon removals. And in climate policy, we have like one mantra or one really conviction. What is not measured will not be done. So whatever we've done, also in other sectors, we were first always interested in the monitoring, reporting, verification, and to make that credible and robust. So we need to know, if we change agricultural practices, what are the impacts on the emissions, on the carbon removals. So, and for this, we've agreed the carbon removal and carbon farming certification framework. This is our first step in certifying emission reductions and carbon removals. We are first, of course, interested in getting down the emissions from the use of fertilizers, from the drained peatlands. So rewetting of drained peatlands is a very important task for us. It's not an easy one. Then, of course, how much carbon can we sequester in our soils, in our forests? And then we will also look into the certification of emission reductions from livestock. So, and that should be happening over the next 1 or 2 years, so that by the end of 26, we really have a first set of methodologies to do monitoring, reporting, verification of emissions and removals on the farm. So, and the whole system is set up within this framework. In the framework, we've set out certain quality criteria. I think one we will discuss today probably more is the quantification. So how robustly can we measure emission reductions, carbon removals on the farm? How additional it is, the question of baseline setting, then the liability. So how are the incentives for the farmers to keep the carbon in? And then very importantly, and what sets us apart a bit from private certification frameworks, is the sustainability. So the co-legislators, Parliament and Member States, want us to only certify carbon removals and emission reductions that are also sustainable, that also lead to benefits for biodiversity, for soil quality, that fight against the land degradation. So this we also need to include. So, and now we are working with an expert group on developing those methodologies. We are, of course, counting very much on your help, on your input. It's with you. It's with the projects under the Mission for Healthy Soils. In particular, we have Credible as a main forum to give us the the input, the practice, the best practices that are currently existing. We had a very good meeting with Credible in Valencia in March. We had a very good expert group meeting in April. We want to do the next one in October, and there we already want to discuss concrete text. We want to come out with a European draft methodology for soil carbon sequestration. And so within the next month, so let's say from now, 1 year on, we should have like 20, 30 pages that say exactly how do we measure, how do we monitor, how do we verify soil carbon to have a start. This will not be the perfect methodology, probably, because there's still a lot to learn, but it should be a very robust methodology with which we can create trust. So I'm very happy to discuss how we can get there. And then our vision for that is that we get really into a European-wide soil map. Hans will talk more about the soil monitoring. Laura Emanuel is also here. Or we have to set up this registry by 28. And there will be a certificate of compliance. So everyone who participates in this voluntary certification will get a certificate of compliance where we can put the key performance indicators that we need for soil carbon, but also for biodiversity, for soil quality at the level of a farm or a group of farms. It will not only always be an individual farmer, but what we see in practice with the certification that more farmers are getting together. You have economies of scale, you have risk pooling, which makes a lot of sense. So, and then if you look into the future, maybe towards 2035, 2040, this registry could really become a map where we have all the key performance indicators on nature at the level of the individual plots throughout Europe. And then we would have a unique information system that can work for our national inventories, but also for the companies for the Scope 3 reporting that they are very, very interested in. So there's a lot of potential in what we are doing here, but first we need to get started. But I still want to give also a bit the policy perspective is how would we think that we then can set effective financial incentives for farmers to take up those practices, to move to a more sustainable agriculture, to a more resilient agriculture that we need then for 2040, 2050. Currently, a lot of that, what is happening here, is in the voluntary space. As I've already said, the big food processors are very interested in reducing their Scope 3 emissions because they want to make these claims towards the consumers, but I think maybe even more importantly, towards their investors. And everyone is trying a little bit different, how they try to give incentives to the farmers, how they try to account for the Scope 3 emissions, and so on. So with our framework, we could already help them to have a level playing field in this to make it more comparable, the claims more comparable. There we have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Co-legislators are looking currently into the green claims that should standardize these types of claims so much more, but underlying they need our certification framework, they need the monitoring, reporting, verification. And then, of course, what the new Commission will need to start thinking about is the climate and the agricultural policy after 2030. So in here we've started a discussion is could a trading system based on these certificates, like an emission trading system as we know it from other sectors, also be helpful for the agri-food supply chain. So I have so when you think about what I've already said is the big food processors are already looking into voluntary commitments to reduce emissions by 20-30%. So that we could regulate and mandate them to say, okay, you have to reduce by 20-30%. This is like in the range what we would need to get to climate neutrality in 2040, 2050. And then to fulfill that obligation, they would need to buy those certificates, maybe from the same farmer from whom they procure the food, but it could be also another farmer. So you could open up a market for ecosystem services. And we've already done one study on that, which has been quite well received in Brussels. So we are coming up with a second study where we will look more closely on these impacts and really look, can that be a good deal for farmers? And we'll have next week on Wednesday a kickoff event for that, and then have 5 workshops where we'll look at the impacts on farmers, on consumer prices, on competitiveness. At the same time, we are continuing our technical work in coming up with these European methodologies. There's also a lot of discussion going on in Credible in the focus groups. And we also have the new calls for the Mission for Healthy Soils, where we have one very interesting project where we want to see on high spatial monitoring approaches and how we can mix that data with the national inventories, and also to find examples how a registry could look like. Yeah, and then I've already talked about our event next week. So for me, what I would really be very interested to learn from this morning, from this session, is how can we, by next year, have a robust monitoring system for soil carbon on which we can base financial incentives so that we can reward those farmers who take the right steps towards a more sustainable, more resilient agriculture that we then need for 2040, 2050, when we need to rely more on the bioeconomy because we don't have any more the fossil carbon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Christian. Just briefly, I suppose a quick question, if you would. You mentioned that agriculture will have to do a lot of heavy lifting moving forward, especially out towards 2050. So what do you see as the key ingredients so to evoke that change? So it's a major transition potentially. It can be beneficial, as you outlined, in terms of other ecosystem services. But what do you think will help, or what are the key ingredients for that mass movement or mass transition?
I mean, you are saying the right word, mass. And I think in climate policies, in every sector, it's about the scale up. I think we don't need to invent so many more technologies. Like, for example, if you look at renewable energy, we know how hydrogen works. We know how batteries work, but we need to scale it up. We need to think about the uptake. And without being a soil scientist or having a very deep knowledge about agricultural practice, I think it's here the same. Or what I see when having been at the Credible Summit in March, there's so much interest in doing a different type of agriculture. And I think people are very ready to do this and very interested to it. The question here is also, how is the scale up? How can we, based on the current monitoring methodologies that we have, go quickly into rolling that out, in getting more data from the field, and then learn, and how we can step it up. So climate policy is always about stepping up, scaling up, because unfortunately we don't have a lot of time.
That's an important piece in terms of the time issue and getting this mass transition. I'll take one quick question from the audience if there is one. If not, we'll move along and we'll come back to this. So, is there a question?
Hi, thank you. It was a lovely presentation. I just want to ask you something about the financing. You said that the food processors would be interested in incentivizing farmers, but as far as I know, and I have talked to some big food processors, they are really relying on public incentives to fund the farmers, to incentivize the farmers. Secondly, what do you mean by sustainable financing? How would you define it?
Yeah, I think it will be a mix of public and private financing. But what we see in other sectors is if you have a trading system for ecosystem services of emissions and removals. You have kind of a currency, and CO2, also like the financial sector understands by now. We have the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. I think every chief financial officer will have heard about that also the company should become climate neutral. And so this is what food processors are looking into. And I think, and there it's about paying for the service. But at the same time, of course, you need to finance the investments. You need to finance the transition. And this is what in other sectors we do with the revenues from the emission trading system. Like we have the Innovation Fund, where we finance the first steel plant in Sweden based on green hydrogen. So you need to find the right balance between, I think, outcome result-based payments and the support of the investments. And I think a lot of also banks, insurances, in particular in insurances, are very interested in investing in agriculture because they see the risks also to their own business. So it's about finding the right combination between public and private financing. And I think what one has to be very aware of is that there's much more private money than public money. In particular, when looking into the next Commission budget, there will be big expenses coming up due to the geopolitical situation we are in. So public budgets will get tighter. So leveraging private investments will be very essential.
Thank you, Christian. We'll move along and we'll come back to these issues, I'm sure, in the panel discussion. So up next is one of the EJP soil presentations. So Felix Sedel from Junin Institute, and Felix will talk about results supporting carbon sequestration potential and the trade-offs, of course. So over to you, Felix.
Yes, thank you, and good morning, everyone. David said heavy lifting in agriculture, and today I want to show you the weights. I have 3 blocks, and let's be efficient about it. So first, organic soils in agriculture. The organic soils under agriculture use are a source of high greenhouse gas emissions, and leaving this cultivated peatland uncultivated will basically just take them out of production while not reducing the emissions we have. So paludiculture and crop production in wet conditions could be a solution to this issue, because then we have the crop production that is generating an income, and we have the re-wetting that reduces the greenhouse gas emissions. Looking at this graph, for example, in the yellow line, you see under +4 degrees Celsius warming conditions compared to today, in a drained peatland, we have high emissions, and just by re-wetting it, following the arrow down to the blue line, we can slash these emissions in half. And the same is true for less warming of 1.6 degrees, where we can also slash the reductions in half just by raising the water table by a few decimeters. And this should be really the key message here: promote re-wetting of drained peatlands. It's also good, or therefore it's a climate mitigation measure, because the higher the warming, the more important this measure becomes. And there is no need to take the sites out of production, and instead we should promote paludiculture or farming in wet conditions. And for this, we need to improve the policy coherence by creating incentives to re-wet these sites. Let's go to the second part, where it's now about mineral soils in agriculture. And here's a very nice picture, and it suggests simplicity. It is quite the opposite. What did we do in Carbosec? On the left, we have all European agricultural land that is available currently and in production. This is 218 million hectares. I called it the EU Plus because it includes Norway, Switzerland, and Turkey. And we calculated an area of implementation. This is the baseline for all measures that I present to you now in the middle, where we apply certain rules and reduce this area to a more feasible thing. And you can see that in terms of CO2 equivalence, one of the most efficient measures to sequester carbon potentially is biochar, followed by woody features such as hedges, by tillage, crop residues, perennial legumes and temporary lays, cover crops, and irrigation. To put these numbers that we calculated a little bit into context, there has been a study that put together emissions of reduced tillage, crop residues, lay rotations, and cover crops, where they calculated between 550 to 2,200 million tons of CO2 equivalents could be offset. And our numbers are in the same ballpark with 1,800 million tons of CO2. But these numbers are very theoretical, and maybe more useful are these numbers. We calculated it down to yearly sequestration potential, and everything in green is what I will call now the feasible option, which is a bit more conservative in what we can do. So it's the lower end of this potential. And how did we calculate it? Very briefly, for soil organic carbon, we assumed after 50 years an equilibrium. For the biochar, it is calculated over 100 years, while for the biomass of hedges, for example, we assumed after 30 years an equilibrium biomass. This is how these numbers were calculated. So we have there nowadays in 2020 in the EU plus, so Turkey, Switzerland, Norway, including, we have about 470 million tons of CO2 equivalents in agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, but in total emissions about 4,400. What does that now mean for our measures, the weights that I've been talking about? That means if we take those highlighted in green, we could offset up to 17% of yearly emitted greenhouse gas emissions of agriculture, or 2% of total EU plus emissions, potentially. Why didn't I put the biochar in here? Because it is the same with every single measure here. It is not so simple, and biochar will be the example for this. How feasible is biochar as a measure? We need 2.8 billion tons of biochar, and this needs to come from 12.6 billion tons of biomass dry weight. Where do we get this from? Currently, the EBC certified production of biochar is 0.046 million tons. Million, not billion. And you can see it will take us roughly 4,750 years to produce the biochar with the current emission. This is not what I would call feasible. So where do we get this additional biomass from? We could use hedge prunings. There's unfortunately only a very old study from 2019 that calculated unused hedge prunings are about 13.7 million tons of woody biomass, or 3 million tons of biochar. If we implement our woody measure that I just presented, we could have 8 million more tons of biochar per year. And if we would take straw that is currently used for energy production or available for energy production, that would be another 32 million tons of biochar. And now we're starting to become feasible, because this would mean 68 years to produce this biochar, assuming we have the production plants and capacities, and we're not even talking about the price of biochar. That's what I mean with we need to consider for every measure, how feasible is it really? And so if we include biochar, just to have this calculation, we could offset potentially 33% of the yearly greenhouse gas emissions of the EU plus, or 4% of the total emissions. Also, to put this into perspective, it's always fine to show your own numbers, but it's nice if somebody agrees. And there is somebody agreeing. They calculated, Rodriguez et al., 0.1 to 27% of the agricultural greenhouse gases could be potentially maybe offset. So we are in the right ballpark with our numbers, which is a bit reassuring. And yeah, as I mentioned, all measures come with different synergies and trade-offs. We can never forget. I will remind you in a few minutes what we can't forget. But first, there is another thing that is a bit more new, which is plant function traits that are drivers for carbon sequestration, mainly roots. We can manage roots if we select varieties better. Through better variety selection and soil management, we can increase the soil inputs to, the root inputs to soil, that way around. Also, here we can also get increased yield and increased root biomass. So that is not always a negative trade-off. And also for cover crops, if we design them well, we can increase the shoot to root growth ratio. So there are many, many potentials to play with the roots and increase the carbon inputs to soil without changing the way we work currently in agriculture. So we need to keep these plant functional traits in mind, and we can't forget about the microbial community as well. So by implementing agroecological management practices, we can increase the plant diversity, reduce soil disturbance, we optimize our variety selection, and through that, we shape the soil microbial community that is involved in the carbon cycling, which is in the end modulating the carbon use efficiency and the soil carbon storage. So we can also play with that. Key messages of this part. Soil carbon measures can compensate yearly up to 17% of current greenhouse gas emissions in agriculture. They bring synergies to other targets. For example, they can improve soil health if implemented correctly. Biochar seems to be a very promising tool. However, the supply of biomass and the production quantities are a problem still. And there seem to be little synergy effects in Europe. And soil carbon measures will reach an equilibrium and not continue to sequester carbon at some point, while biochar keeps locking up carbon. That is a big plus for the biochar. And increasing root carbon inputs is also a good tool to bring carbon to the soil through optimized variety selection, considering the involved microbial communities. But overall, and that is my favorite point on this slide, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That is the key to whatever we do. We go to the last part, non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions, the trade-offs I've been mentioning. Here, the example of N2O emissions due to organic matter inputs. Overall, you can see from this beautiful graph that there seems to be a slight tendency to reduce N2O emissions through these measures. Oops, one too much. And here for the biochar, interesting, we could offset actually or reduce the N2O emissions by up to 33%, depending on climate and soil properties, which is a good news for the measure. And the carbon sequestration in soils depends on the type of external organic matter. So we need to keep that in mind. It's not all organic matter is great. Whoop. And for the other organic matter types, there seems to be no effect compared to the mineral N reference, but the application strategy is important for the emissions. If it's just organic matter, we have a reduction, but usually we also add mineral fertilizer and then we have increased emissions. So this is the trade-off here. And this is relevant for our crop residue measure. So please keep in mind here in the graph, you can see on the left, there seems to be a slight reduction. Let's get into it. The Summit project found exactly something out about this, marked in yellow there, the CN ratio. I will not get too technical. The key message of this graph is that the crop residue influence on N2O emissions is not a major issue, and their management is not expected to cancel out the efforts to increase carbon storage to soil. So that is good news for the straw measure that I've been suggesting a few minutes ago. Here is another nice table from the project where they show this also for other measures. You see there is carbon sequestration happening for certain measures, but the N2O emissions are increasing. A minus means a release from the soil, so the opposite of what we would like to have. But the total net effect is always a positive one, which means we can implement the measures and reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions, even if we consider the N2O emissions. But you can also see at the bottom, by just balancing the N fertilization, we already have great effects, greater, for example, than implementing cover crops. So that is a key. So here the key messages for this last part. Measures to increase carbon sequestration often increase N2O emissions, but not so much that this is a net problem. N2O emissions tend to reduce to organic matter inputs, depending on the type, and balanced fertilizer adjusted to the crop needs may still yield big reductions in N2O emissions, while not uptaking carbon, but at least reducing emissions. And with this, I will stop. Thank you.
Super. Thank you. Thank you, Felix. What I'm hearing is not necessarily a silver bullet. We will need mitigation. And I suppose the feasibility comes loud and clear. I think your example was very stark. We'll move along. We'll hold questions and move along to the next presentation. And we'll have opportunities to ask all the speakers plenty of questions as we move along. Next up is Greet Reischart from ILVO. Greet will talk about results supporting the MRV side of the house and the carbon farming. So I think this kind of speaks exactly to what Christian talked about, and hopefully there's some insights from the science from Greet. Okay, over to you.
Okay, thank you. So indeed, I was asked to give a presentation on HAP soil and monitoring, reporting, verification, but HAP soil didn't have really a project specifically on this topic. So I was thinking, yeah, how to do that. But I was thinking also like, okay, although we didn't really work on MRV itself, I believe that HAP soil has done a lot of work in preparation for such a systems. So that's what I want to show here. So first of all, there was this project that has compiled like 162 carbon farming schemes in Europe, but also outside of this. And you can see the results. They have made a very nice web tool out of it where you can search through the characteristics. You can see that there are large differences, not only about scale, but also the monitoring systems. They have also been interacting with stakeholders and farmers, and well, they found out that farmers are quite skeptical actually towards results-based carbon farming schemes, and they also have limited faith in models, so there is something to do there. They also have thought about roadmaps, also roadmaps for local support to carbon farming scheme, because no one fits all, so that's quite important message, I think, and also important to facilitate at the local level. Also in work package 8, there was like this kind of inventory actually about carbon farming methods, and especially outside Europe. So they have also did an inventory on the assessment methods that are used there. Then there was a project also that has inventoried decision support tools, and they have found throughout Europe 45 tools already for carbon. So that's all kinds of tools directed to farmers, for instance. So that's also a great source to look at. Okay, so Christian talked about already, it's all about the upscaling. We know actually what to do, what are the good practices, but how will we measure it? And this has also been presented already by Claire in the expert group meeting of the CRCF. So we believe indeed that there is a good connection needed between models and data and farm data and sampling methodologies and remote sensing, and how to do this, how to connect this all together. There is one report I would like to refer to. It's work package 6. It's a good basis, I think, to look in, because they have inventoried like all kinds of measurements methods, but also proximal sensing, remote sensing. So it's a good basis for us all. And as I said, I would like to highlight here that actually in this community of HAP soil, we have been working together, all together, in all of this kind of building blocks, to harmonize, to exchange knowledge, to make databases, and so on. And I believe these are the pieces of the puzzle that we need actually for developing these MRV systems. And it will be used also in future research, also for the soil mission. Okay, so on the modeling, for instance, we had a project, also the Carbosec project has developed a modeling toolbox, which is being used now both at the European level and in the member states. So that's a great exercise we can do there, and starts also a good side of the harmonization. Several projects have been working with models, have been testing them, etc. There were also 2 projects that worked on the inclusion of soil biodiversity indicators in carbon models. It's certainly not complete, this list. And what I also liked very much about HAP soil, it was the capacity building, because yeah, by the exchange, the training of people. So for instance, here last month, there was this PhD school for data management and modeling, actually. So many, mainly young researchers have followed this PhD school and learned a whole lot of things. This was in Sweden. Well, we have to test the models, you know, we have to develop it, to calibrate it, validate it, and there it's very important to have good data from long-term field experiments, for instance. They also help to get knowledge on the carbon farming practices itself, but also the measurements. But how to access this? Because there's a lot, you know, a big bottleneck is actually the access of data. We have a lot of data, but how is it accessible in a harmonized manner? So we worked on this inventory of more than 240 European long-term field experiments. We collected the metadata, and this is now in a nicely integrated in the Bonaris platform, actually, where the right field experiments can be
search. And so it's a great source also of researchers to look for the right data and experiments. Not always. Okay. So it's already been used, for instance, also for databases in Carbosec on the crop management issues. There we have looked into the impacts of different carbon farming practices, but also, for instance, in EOM for soil, which has been looking at the organic amendments. Now, we can have models, we can calibrate, validate the models, etc. But it's indeed about the upscaling. So how to move from the benchmark sites actually to the farm level, to be able to monitor at any farm and at any farmer's fields, but also to move further to the regional, the national and European data. And therefore, we need data sources, to feed the models. For instance, data on soil, on climate, on land use, etc. Well, it's nice that the work package 6 has worked a lot actually on data harmonization, on data layers. They have compared the Lucas monitoring network with the national monitoring network because altogether we have more data. And also this AGP soil meta catalog is very useful because, you can search, for instance, in your country what data layers are already available. So regarding remote sensing, detection of carbon was worked on and also sampling protocols and sampling strategies. So first of all, we have the proximal sensing, right? So there were some projects looked into the different methodologies for proximal sensing, the cost accuracies, and also the combination with covariates. And they also have done some activities for capacity building and organized this series of webinars together with that. I believe that was a collaboration between different projects. The Steropis project has been working further in a very collaborative manner, I must say, between how to detect, and is it possible to detect, and with what accuracy we can detect soil organic carbon in the top layer of arable soils. Well, actually for the Earth observation, that's like a general recommendation. So there is a very high potential for upscaling, but there is also some concern within the science community, I must say, for transparency. So we need really good methodologies to validate and assess the accuracies of these products and these services that are coming out. So we need some harmonized protocols, but maybe we also have the recommendation to establish like a kind of benchmark sites to validate the accuracy of these products. And it's not existing for the moment, so maybe it's something to work on. What was also done in the project is then using these data layers, because actually the assessment of carbon by remote sensing is not accurate enough, although there are advances made, but it's not accurate enough actually. But it could be used, for instance, to develop further sampling strategies at the farm level. And now I would like to come back to the slides of Christian, actually, because it's not only about carbon, it's also about reducing fertilizer use, for instance, reducing soil emissions, rewetting of peatlands, but also the sustainability. I will not go into detail here because I believe many of these things will also will be a topic in the later sessions of today. But as Felix also has said, so several projects has worked on these trade-offs. They have made tools also to assess these trade-offs. And several projects were working also on the soil health indicators. But I think we can have a discussion on these later on. This presentation was not complete, I know. So many results are still on their way, and I might have missed several activities that were going on that are already also very relevant for this context. So please, if you have worked also on these pieces of elements that was not mentioned yet, send them to us, and then we can further improve this overview. And I would also like to draw the attention to all the materials on the website, policy briefs and webinars, etc., that were organized. Thank you also for all the contributors.
Thank you, Greet. And I suppose many pieces of architecture need to come together to make this work, and we will get to that in the questions. I would now ask the panel, so Claire Chanou, Christian, Greet, and Felix to come to the front, and I would call on Fernando Mayano to take the stage, I suppose, and give the first reflection from the farmer or practitioner perspective. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you for the invitation. Very happy to be here. I was asked not to give a presentation, but to react to what I hear and share my thoughts after a year and a half being in the applied sector in this company called Climate Farmers. I come from a scientific background, as some of you know, working on soil carbon models, and yes, so I don't claim to speak for the farmers. I have some contact with the farmers. I hear what they're saying to us. So this is my view. And I wrote down several points now listening to the presentations, and I think the science, as what I see is happening right now, is taking the concerns that we have in the practical side quite seriously, very seriously. And I'm not sure there's going to be much new, but I hope so. I don't know how long I'm going to take. Please just let me know when the time is up. So one thing that has become very evident to us now, starting because we are a startup company, and as you probably know, the carbon farming sector is a startup sector everywhere. There are very few actually emitted credits for carbon farming. We have emitted the first credits this year, very recently, as first, let's say, pilot project. And what we're seeing now that we're trying to scale up is that we have quite a conflict between the need to be complete and accurate, and at the same time, the need to keep it simple. Being a scientist, I'm very much for being accurate, being precise, but reality on the ground is different. Yeah, what we're seeing as a major blocker right now is the ability of farmers to provide us with the information that we need to come up with numbers, right? So we're pretty much relying on the established methodologies that we have today that pretty much try to include a full picture of a farm's greenhouse gas balance, namely getting a complete set of data to calculate carbon inputs, calculations of N2O emissions, calculations of methane emissions from animals, emissions from fertilizers, etc. So the large challenge, what we see now, is on the farmers' side. The farmers are busy people. Yeah. And what we hear again and again is that farmers are pretty much sick of having to fill out forms. Yeah. And then we come again to the farmers and tell them, can you please fill out these pages and pages of form, and please do this on time, and please do it once a year. And what we can promise them is that maybe they will get some money for it. And that's not guaranteed at all, right? Because that brings me to a second point. is the question of additionality in carbon farming and farming in general. Additionality is a very central and important aspect of the carbon market and creating carbon credits, but it's not so easy to define in a farming context, right? Because there is no purely traditional farmer and there's no purely regenerative farmer. Farmers may have started changing the way they till, and maybe they started doing minimum till at some point. Maybe they do no till on part of their farm. So who says where additionality starts and where it doesn't? These are some things that are hard to define. But when we tell a farmer, listen, you can get financial incentive, financial support with carbon credits if you transition. First of all, don't be very regenerative already, because we cannot take you because we need additionality. What this means for many farmers is that there's a transition period where they will make minimal or even no credits, because transitioning might be easier for very large farms in Ukraine, where there is an easy option to replace, let's say, full tillage with some other practice, or go from bare soil to cover crops in a couple of thousands of hectares. But for medium and small farmers in Southern Europe, where we are working, the transition is much more complex. They might be starting from very poor soils that need a couple of years of improvements before they see the benefits. So that's where this promise of having a financial incentive becomes a bit void unless they are lucky or very efficient. And there's a ton of knowledge that is required for transitioning to change from traditional to regenerative agriculture. So that's a couple of aspects that the farmers are dealing with, and certainly are, as we see right now, a blocker for moving forward as a company, and I think as a sector. And from our side, what we find is that we are missing context-specific information, both scientific information, scientific understanding. I mean, who has done a review of the effects of tillage recently? What is the impact of tillage? 5% in average. It goes from plus 30 to minus 20. I'm sure that if we get a bit more context specific, we can improve that number. Model calibration, we're using Roth-C, right? Which was calibrated in Rothamsted from field and laboratory experiments. But we're applying these models in our global simulations, whereas we know these are not very accurate in different ecosystems. Where is the context-specific calibration? I mean, we've done this with a rather poor set of data we could find. So how much time do I have? Okay, I'll go through a couple of more points more quickly. So that context-specific data is becoming very critical, I think, also to create baselines. Many farmers have a hard time knowing their baselines, very hard time. This is becoming a major blocker, and the solution seems to be that farmers who took over a farm just don't have the information or just didn't note it down. We have to give them a regional default baseline. And it's a hard thing to do. And to do it, that is fair for everybody, right? Precision versus accuracy. We know we have a lot of random error in our quantifications. If we're using Roth-C, climate, soil, the data from the farmers itself has a big amount of random error. We know that we're off the mark. but is this a bias, a general bias, or is it, do we remain accurate in general? So we have to determine that. And right now we're basically cutting off 20% of our calculated credits because we assume a certain level of uncertainty. It's a pretty big hit, and maybe we can improve that. Given that accuracy and the complexity, many people are looking at remote sensing as a solution, saying, okay, if we just look at net primary productivity from satellites, is it really that much worse than what we're doing? We don't have a bias inherently part of reported data, right? Data is reported right now from farmers themselves. Of course, they are an interested party. So I guess that explains a bit of that 20% we're cutting off, but who's happy with that, right? Well, I've heard a bunch of other things today that are super interesting. Biochar, its potential, but that really doesn't fit into how we model things right now. We need a solution for that. We've gone through the literature for biochar. It's not really easy to find a consensus. We need a bit of consensus across the board. We need the scientific community to come together and give consensus, create this level playing field we talked about, give alternative methods, maybe not always based on a full set of farm data and modeling, but maybe remote sense based, maybe with a different level of uncertainty, but as an alternative way of calculating carbon sequestration. We need to keep, whatever we do, we need to adjust our predictions through repeated verification, soil testing. As a startup, this becomes quite expensive, right? And we're trying to make this work, and we have limited resources. At the same time, knowing that we don't know where our predictions are compared to reality. So it's a difficult situation.
So we're hearing many concerns, Fernando.
And I'm going to stop there and leave the rest for.
We'll get some reflections, I think, on those. I think it's very important to get such a perspective, because obviously it's the farmers or the practitioners that will be implementing much of this, and I think it's really important that, you know, the audience, who is largely scientists, hear these concerns and we can get some responses.
Yeah.
So I'll go to the panel, and first of all, I'll ask Christian maybe to get some reflection. So a round of applause. So Christian, if you would give some initial reflections on some of those concerns.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Super interesting presentations and very inspiring. I think everyone has to play its part in the game, and like what we can do as regulators, we can create the overall framework. We can probably find a good practical solution on the baseline for Europe to start with, to provide fallback values, to provide the indicators for the biodiversity, for the sustainability. So, for example, on landscape elements, the difference or the distance for pollinators, and so on. So that we can do, and we can provide clarity and reassurance. And I think the main thing that we can provide is that the investors will say, okay, look, this is something that has been approved by the European Commission, and that makes a difference. And I think your job for climate farmers or Indigo or whoever, Soil Capital, whoever is trying this business, for you, I think the work is with the farmers. And I think the one who will succeed is who offers the farmers the best package in terms of user friendliness. Well, this is what I always hear the most is, okay, farmers don't want to put more time into filling in forms. So there's also something that we can do in making accessible also the data maybe from the land parcel identification system and so on. But I think this will be where you will compete with other operators in that space. And I have a great sympathy for this concept that we also introduced in the regulation. Is this group of operators that you get more farmers together, and then you are there coordinating these farmers and doing all the paperwork, all the administration, issuing the credits. And of course, the more farmers you get, the more you can do the risk pooling, the more you can take out the error, assuming it's a random error. And of course, if you get a portfolio of farmers from Spain over to Finland and to Greece, you can do a lot of the risk pooling. I think everything related also to liability, we need to get also insurance companies much more interested. I mean, insurance companies are already active with insuring harvest and so on. So I think they're also very interested in taking over there a certain amount of that risk. So, but I think overall what it shows, but what you've said, is we need to work at all levels, not only on the science. The monitoring is important, but also developing this business concept and making it user friendly for the farmers. But I think it's not only like one single entity or person who needs to do everything, but it's all over the ecosystem where everyone can work on it.
Claire, if I could move to you to ask for some reflections. I suppose what has been outlined here is a number of concerns in terms of the science there from the farmer's perspective, and maybe you might have a comment from an overview point from EJP Soil.
Thank you, David. Well, it was a pleasure for us to see the the different perspectives of the different actors, scientists, company, carbon farming company. And yes, what it made me that we definitely we need to have, I think everyone needs to have estimates of these carbon sequestration potential in soils. And it was very clearly shown is that we need to have different types of estimates. And for some of them, we have the methodology. And I think we're working on an improved methodology for technical potential of carbon sequestration or carbon accrual in soil, but then have to modulate with what is feasible technical potential, what is the resource of biomass, for example. But that's not enough. Well, and I would say in the literature, often you have just theoretical potential. So that's already a progress, but we also need to have economical potential. How much can we do for a given cost? And for me, there's another layer, and this we will do in CarbonSec, but there's another layer we will not approach in CarbonSec, and I think this is also many parties need, is what is the socially acceptable potential that is considering the capacity of the farmers, their ability, the regulations, there's the incentives. And for this, we even have to build a methodology on how to assess that. So that's really important. And probably have to go, I don't know if you deal a lot with this, with going from practices to systems, combinations, complex combinations of practices. And one thing I wanted to ask to, I think it came, I don't know if it came in your presentation, Christian, but it, of course, with you is, and Reed, is that farmers actually apparently are quite skeptical about results-based approach. They are skeptical about models. This is the only thing we know how, well, this is our tools in science. How can we improve that? What to do? Is it necessary to provide completely alternative methods, even though if the background work is done with modeling, to convince the farmers? Or yes, what is the way forward?
Fernando, would you like to respond quickly to that?
That's a good question. Yeah, the thing about models is that they need good input data to rubbish in, rubbish out. But so it all depends on the quality of what you're feeding the model with, right? So that's why the monitoring part is critical. Of course, if you go to remote sensing, the monitoring part becomes trivial after you do some foreground work. But we don't. They have questions. In a way, they are skeptical, but they do not question it after they get a few answers.
So if I could go quickly to Greet before we go to the floor, and please start thinking about your questions on the floor. Just in that space, Greet, you mentioned the long-term experiments or the benchmark sites. Can they be that verification that might be needed by the farmers, the real measurements, etc., or is it data and models? How can we come together, I suppose, in terms of that system to verify and to make it more certain?
Yeah, I think for the long-term field experiments, they do have a great value, I think, initially to improve models, etc., and calibrate and validate them. But then it's up. Yeah, we go to the upscaling. So it's indeed what data do we use as input, like any farm. So if we go to the farmer, we don't have all this detailed information as we have on the benchmark sites. So I think we need also another type of benchmark sites, actually. So not only the long-term field experiments, but also a network on farm where we have a network of a few farms maybe, but also some fields in the farms where we have a lot of measurements, where we measure a lot and could serve as a kind of data set where different companies maybe could go, where different scientists could go to calibrate and validate and verify their monitoring methods, really using data on the farm. So I really think this is really crucial. Also because you mentioned the verification, so it's also costly. Like at the end, how accurate is your system? I think this should be continuously monitored, and such a monitoring network of benchmark sites on farm could help. But it would be best that this is established like in a coordinated way, so that not all institutes or all private companies have to do it separately. But like
you mentioned private companies there, they have a lot of data too. Can they collaborate here potentially?
Yeah, that's another point, I think. So, but coming back to the benchmark site, I think it's also needed for the remote sensing, actually, because I hear a lot of concern in the remote sensing community also that there are a lot of services, many private companies also come up with services, but it's not clear how accurate it is. So if we would have this kind of benchmark sites where this could be validated, maybe it could also create more trust in the system. And then coming to the private companies, indeed, from a scientist perspective, I think we want to collaborate in an open way, but we are often quite slow, maybe. The private companies, they really want to move forward. You have a lot of data, but so there is like this space, like how to collaborate, how to make use of the private data, but also there are some concerns maybe because there is some, a competition between private companies, but also how to connect this public efforts with the private efforts. I think it's where is the win-win for everybody to move forward? That's I think a crucial question.
Shall we move to the floor?
Okay. Questions or maybe also suggestions, constructive remarks. Bear in mind that we are having a discussion not only amongst scientists, but with policymakers, with the sector. Who takes the first question or suggestion?
Please,
Thank you.
Please also give your affiliation.
Yes.
Your name and affiliation.
I am Edoardo Costantini from Italy. I am member of the advisory board of the EGP Soil. Okay. And I have a question and observation to Felix. In your analysis, it seems that you are not considered well the reality of the tree crops. You know that in Europe we have about 11 million hectares of tree crops. And I have an experience in vineyards, for instance, and there are about 3.2 million hectares of vineyards in Europe. And every year, there are about 160,000 hectares planted or replanted of vineyards. And this causes a huge loss of carbon. A rough estimate say that every year, just from this activity, we lost about 500,000 tons of carbon. My solution is that you should take into account also this, and this is something which has not monitored at all. So I think that you should monitor it. This is my solution.
Felix.
Yeah, maybe just a short point on that. We have not considered vineyards in this exercise, as land-wise they're less relevant than the systems we looked at, but I totally agree that this is something that should be taken into account, and that's what I also mentioned when I said this graph looks so nice and easy, but there's a huge asterisk on every single of these points there, and there are many assumptions that we made and decisions that we could debate forever. In fact, we've debated those over the last 3 years, I believe. We were supposed to have that 2 years ago, and I finished it last week. So that maybe reflects also how much debate was even within and among us scientists about the things we're doing there. And therefore, yeah, that is something to consider. And that is something, as the scientists like to say, for future research. I'm sorry, that is not a happy answer.
No. Okay. A question or suggestion, I don't know, from Ennio Vak from Flanders.
Hi, question for Christian, please. So there was a lot of emphasis put on the potential of food processors to contribute to carbon farming through insetting schemes and their potential. But my question is, will there be some accompanying initiatives regarding the power dynamics of farmers? Because going this route might imply that these food processors have even more control on the conditions to produce food on private farms. Thank you.
Christian?
Yeah, that's one of the key questions. How could you design such a market? How could you design such a market that it brings more market power to the farmers? And what we are considering is to kind of create a second product that can be traded independently of your food, of your crop, or whatever you sell to the food processors. And then you get additional income from the emission reductions from the carbon removals. And that you may also sell to another food processor who may be willing to pay more. Or another design question is whether we would open that market, for example, to players from outside the agri-food supply chain, airlines, or whether the Commission could be kind of a market maker and also procure some of these credits to influence the price a little bit like a central bank. So there can be a lot of design questions around how to design such a market. I think it's also a consideration is, do you want to have like both the eco schemes under the common agricultural policy and so on? Do you want to have a lot of regulations from that side, in addition to what the food processors want from you as a farmer? Or should we try to have a single system, a more regulated system, where there's more transparency, where there's one set of rules? And because...
And what is your answer to your question? You give two possibilities. What is your opinion?
But this is something we need to discuss with the
Okay.
sector. I'm not here coming from
No.
from
Okay.
above, and I mean, or this is like everything we've done in climate policy, we've always discussed with the sector.
Okay.
And we first need to have a vision where the sector wants to be in 2040, 2050. And that, of course, all players must agree on. If we don't know where we are going, it's difficult to discuss how we arrive there.
Thank you. I hear the bottom-up argument. Okay. This becomes interesting because you are from DG Climate and now we have DG Agri. Mr. Patel, what do you want to suggest or say?
Just I want to suggest, because I'm listening some reflection on assessment, measurement, and remote sensing, a lot of elements like that. And I want to know if there is a strong connection between maybe some institute as who works on modeling, and the administration under the Ministry of Agriculture. There is a paying agency, and this paying agency are responsible for the payment for the farmer, and they have already used some relevant tool to identify the parcel and something like that. I don't know after if you make maybe login, because we need to, I would say, raise awareness of this paying agency to be ready at some stage to implement some relevant tool from your side.
Great, would you respond?
Great.
Yeah, yeah, sure. I think, well, the region where I come from is Belgium, Flanders. So we are collaborating actually with, because we are lucky that, yeah, I think from what I heard from other colleagues in other countries, maybe we have more access to connect with the CAP data and the field boundaries, etc. So also in one of the LIFE projects funded by the EU, we have tried to connect the model with the CAP information. So this is possible, I think, but I hear that in many other countries, there is a long way to go. And so I'm not so sure what the status is in every country there. So I indeed, if we want to make it a success, I think one of the key things is to digitalize the data and make it operational. And so I think from that side, from the CAP perspective, it would be great actually, because I know they're also working on remote sensing solutions for control, etc. So if this could actually, yeah, being harmonized and become accessible also for the monitoring of carbon farming.
This is a very clear wish. Thank you. Between brackets, this meeting is recorded, so we will be able to re-listen or re-watch what is said here. Very interesting. I have now Liane from Denmark.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's very challenging to apply all of these ideas to for across Europe. So, for instance, in Denmark, I mean, we have issues in relation to residue incorporation and peaks in nitrous oxide. So I find it really challenging in general for policy making as well as how do we standardize some of these potentially relevant measures for carbon sequestration that may not apply everywhere in Europe? And how do we go forward with sort of deciding more, is it whether country specific measures that are more applicable? Do we apply like a rating scheme for, using this is better than that? Or how do we approach that? Because I can see that what's generally suggested as the most relevant measures for reducing carbon as well as N2O do not apply everywhere in Europe. I can say that. So yeah.
So we're hearing the trade-offs, and maybe Felix or Claire, you'd like to respond in terms of which measures are.
Yeah, and we heard already at Fernando's the argument of take the context and the regionality in account. So this is a bit similar as what we hear from Denmark. Okay, Felix? Okay, I'm sorry, Claire?
I think that we really need, this is something I have been discussing with different people, and I think we really need to develop a solid 3D matrix with management options on the one hand, pedoclimatic conditions, but first we have to agree on how to stratify, how to qualify, how name management options, pedoclimatic conditions, what is the best grid for that, and effects on soil functions and ecosystem services. We have a lot of knowledge out there, and we still need a lot of knowledge out there. And I would bet that doing that, we will also find out that, at certain intersections, we have no information. So that's where research is needed. So I hope that within the SOL mission, it will be possible, a project would be great if a project could be devoted to that.
Not to be underestimated, Claire, in terms of the challenge of completing that, but it's needed. Yeah. Felix?
Adding to that, even national level is not good enough. That may work, and I may be wrong here, that may work for Denmark, but we also have, for example, Turkey in the consortium, and that's a very different size of a country. So we need to go down to regional level at least. And Carbosec at least is doing the step right now. I showed you EU plus data. The next step is the national runs. And let's see how that goes. I'm curious to see that.
Yeah.
And then I can give you a more exact answer on how important is it to go down to national or even regional level.
The concern is recognized, and there is like a promise of, yes, you will have your answer. I have Mr. Mihelic from Slovenia with a critical suggestion, I think.
Yeah, it's maybe not so critical, but or it is. We are speaking about single measures like doing minimum tillage and having cover crops and so on. But this is when we are thinking of single measures, we are just producing some bureaucratic thinking. We have to think about systems and systematic approach. And we just have to put the frame, and the farmers would have to have a ability to work freely within the frame. And in this way, we can work really appropriate for every single field, not just region or land. And we have to go out of this measure approach. We have to go to the system approach.
Is that clear enough a suggestion, Christian?
I couldn't agree more.
Okay. Comment
this
on that?
This is what it's about. And there's one currency, which is CO2. But what is done on every farmer, in every landscape, in every region, these guys must be able to advise the farmers what to do there. But the market for it is European, because they are the food processors. And they are about, should I source from Flanders? Should I source from Spain? Should I source from Turkey? And what is my footprint? This is what they are interested in. We need one currency, but what happens at the individual field, this we cannot say in Brussels. And this is where the common agricultural policy has also faced its challenges, as has been seen with the recent discussion. So we need to have a much smarter system here.
Okay.
So
yes, Fernando, you will get the first. Is this your idea of simplicity and accuracy?
I fully agree, and I agree also because in the farm, single measurements don't work. It's not reality. You don't tell a farmer, stop tilling. He stops tilling and his fields or her fields are full of weeds. Nothing works. It's a catastrophe the next year. It's a holistic, it's a systems thinking approach also at the farm to make things work.
Great.
So yeah, I guess that's also why we need models actually, because with a model you could apply different measures, but also from the scientific community, I think we need constant, to work on databases. For instance, you have different crops, you have new crops coming in. So how much carbon do they add to the soil? So in the region where I'm from, we have a list with all the CAP data. So we also have a list with the carbon input from all the crops, but this should still be improved. You know, I know we can do better, but doing more measurements and also have more knowledge on the roots, for instance, but that's something we can work on, I think. And so to be able to also be flexible and just assess what the farmer does and not to impose him on one practice for 10 years, maybe just because otherwise we cannot monitor it.
Okay, thank you. I have Claudia Sá from Portugal.
Thank you. I'm from the Ministry of Agriculture, and I find very interesting this presentation and the constraints presented by Fernando. So I think there is lots of work to do still to put in practice this carbon farming. and to attract the farmers to this system, which of course they will have some revenue in that. But I wonder, the southern countries where mineral soils have very low content on organic matter, organic carbon, how attractive it will be, this certification.
And for whom is the question?
Well, everybody.
Everybody.
So if we
When, maybe Fernando,
Yeah,
when is it affordable, or when is the effort in balance with the rewards?
Yeah, we are working in southern Portugal and Spain. I don't know until we go out there and verify after a few years of changing practices. It's hard for me now to tell you what the real potential there is, but definitely it's going to be less than in moisture climates. So I think something like being certified regenerative might become more attractive than the carbon credits for those farmers.
Other voices? Christian?
Christian?
I think one shouldn't have a tunnel vision just on carbon. These practices that we are talking about are equally good for the resilience, for water management, which may be a much bigger issue in Spain, in southern countries. So what a carbon market can do, it can generate additional income to help the transition. But there shouldn't, but I think no farmer should change their practice just because there is now a little bit of additional money. I think there need to be other benefits on the fertility, on the future resilience, on the value of the nature of the land. And then there is some transitional finance that such a market can provide.
Then it's very important that this sustainability aspect is developed. Well, this is heavily discussed in the Credible project, for example, but this is essential so that carbon could be a lever for transition in agriculture for multiple objectives and soil health, in fact.
That's how we sell our product. We don't sell it as, this is your main motivation. We sell it as this is some help you can get to become regenerative and improve and have resilience in your farm and so forth.
We'll take one final
No,
question.
we have, David, I think we have a quarter of an hour.
Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
more to go. So
Okay.
we have
thought
time for more questions.
Yeah.
I have Mrs. Trentenero from Italy.
It's more a question, more a comment than a question. I really agree with the view of Mr. Christian Holzleitner. And I realize now that I've been in sort of a frame as a farmer. One of those frames, there's just one view, can be more than one. But I've been applying FAO, conservation agriculture pillars since over 20 years ago, 20 years. So, and this is a frame. It's no-till associated with cover crops and crop rotations. So in that, there is every year there is something you can do better. But it's already a frame, and this could be easy to detect, even from just by viewing this. That's it.
Thank you. We'll take that as a comment.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Look, I'd like you to show your appreciation for the panel. A big round of applause.
Break is
Yes. We have another 2 minutes. Okay. Okay.
How much do you need for your conclusion?
We don't need any. If there's questions, keep coming.
Okay.
We'll stick with it. Okay.
Just
Okay.
to be sure.
We'll continue.
10 more minutes of your attention, please.
Hey, I'm Danny Rassi from Nibio. And I was interested in knowing how you think the subsidies can work with the carbon credits. I think the confusion with now, I'm from Norway, so we're not exactly under the cap. It's a little bit of a special case possibly. But we have the reporting, so the link to the IPCC, trying and UNFCCC, trying to develop some methods. And how do we stand there? Because that's very important for the subsidies. And then we have some carbon credits, a tiny bit in the biochar, which is even not necessarily linked to the national level. And my impression is this European carbon market will actually reunite the two. Is that right? Could I have your thoughts about this and how the subsidies can work together with the carbon market?
Of course, there needs to be clarity, transparency, and when we go more into such idea of a market, we of course need to see how subsidies from the common agricultural policy, from state aid, work with that. But what I've said, what we see in other sectors where we already have more these market-based solutions, like in energy and industry, you have an interplay between what happens on the market and investment subsidies or aid for transition. So still continuing income support and so on. So these two can go together. I think in particular, if we think about the rewetting of peatlands, which is a major change in the land use, I don't think that carbon credits on its own will do the job. You need additional public financing. And as we also said before, then there are all these benefits in terms of fertility and so on, what you would expect in the future of having a more valuable natural asset. But of course, all of this needs to be looked at, and the more clarity and the more transparency you have, of course, the better for the farm.
Clear answer. Thank you, Christian. Raja from Austria.
I'm Raja, leading the synthesis in work 7 in EGP soil. Thanks, Felix, for throwing caution into this carbon heavy lifting race. I don't know how many studies in your estimation included multiple management practices on estimating carbon and trade-offs. But until 2019, less than 2% of studies included more than 2 management practices. And the same trend follows in the long-term experiments presented by Greet as well. So what are the real measures that we need to take in order to improve the reliability of farmers and also to increase the standard in CRCF and provide clear recommendations?
Is 1 + 1 + 1 3?
I wish.
Yes. Do we know it?
You're absolutely right with your observation. This is part of a project. I wasn't involved, so I can't tell you the number of studies, but I got enough information that they have a nice overview table of what do we know and how does it affect each measure. And the clear recommendation from, I believe it was a Summit project, maybe I'm wrong, was that we can't look at all these things separately. We need to measure all together, and also not just two. We need to measure everything so that we understand how the interplay works. And how do we get this? We need more experiments on that. And it's the classic, we need data. Without data, we simply don't know. We can do best guesses, which are oftentimes, I dare say, wrong. But we need to find out how to become less wrong through data.
More work on the scientific shelf, but we can already start where we are, maybe. Huh? I have a question from Mr. Helming from the Netherlands.
Yes, thank you. My name is John Helming from Wageningen Economic Research. Maybe my question is a little bit you touched upon already. We heard a lot about incentivizing farmers and that it will be quite difficult. But once we have a baseline for all farmers, how to incentivize farmers a lot more, because I heard a lot of uncertainties from the Commission saying that, yes, there need to be other revenues as well. That all sounds rather vague, right? And the carbon market can generate some money, but farmers will not get rich of this. Is the Commission also considering other market-based measures, like stimulating taxes on mineral fertilizers, for example, or stimulating measures like taxes on nitrogen surpluses, that kind of things. I know taxes are national policies, but I wonder what the Commission could do in this field. Thank you.
Yeah.
Interesting question. Is it for you, Christian, or also for DG Agri? I don't know.
No, I can say something on this because we will develop a methodology for the reduction of N2O emissions. So the reduction of emissions from fertilizer use. So should we look, for example, at the excess of nitrogen, how to do this? So we can incentivize this within our certification framework.
Okay.
Thank you. Are there further questions?
I don't see any questions anymore. Yes, one in front.
Here.
Thank you. Panos Panagos from the European Commission Joint Research Center, European Soil Observatory. So mainly to Gret. As Christian described perfectly this morning, we have an urgency. I mean, next year, this moment, we should have a text of 20 pages describing a standardized baseline methodology. So, you know, the urgency, you know how we work now, both in the GRC and in the soil mission projects. I'm particularly referring to MARVIC and MRV for SOC in this approach, in this context. Are you aware, because you can make the link between the soil mission projects and the EGP, are you aware of any approaches that have been done similar stuff in EGP? I mean, projects that have done developing methodologies to estimate carbon removals.
I'm thinking. Well, I guess, yeah, in theory, what CarbonSec is doing could be a baseline, but maybe it's not accurate enough, maybe. So it's also now used at the national level, but we still have to see how that works. But yeah, I think you know my opinion on this matter. So my opinion would be maybe to work with standardized management and just use a simple model first to start with, and just calculate the baseline with the standardized management, and use the same model for the baseline as for calculating the project line. So that would be my suggestion. But I think for the approach that you use with Lucas, I think there the work of work package 6 with the comparison of the national data and the Lucas data could help, but I was not so much involved in that, so I guess you know that work better than me. I don't know if Claire, you have something to add on this?
No, unless the panelists need to urgently add something to the debates. I'm watching your faces. Not really.
No, it's been a.
Then I ask David Wall, the moderator, co-moderator, to conclude.
Yeah, thank you, Greet. Look, I think we've heard many perspectives. It's good to get the range of perspectives from the farmers to the high up policymakers to the scientists in the middle as a largely scientific audience. Personally, I find this very fruitful in terms of trying to understand the intricacies of policy versus implementation and those on the ground, and then where we fit in the middle in terms of trying to inform this massive undertaking, I would say. We've heard, I suppose, the concerns from yourself, Fernando, in terms of real concerns in terms of how this is implemented, also the potential risks that you perceive in terms of farmers, and the same thing from Christian in terms of the ambition. And I think without that ambition, setting out that ambition, we won't find the path, we won't find a way. But from the scientists in the centre, I suppose it behoves us to provide the information as best we can to manage that information, and data came up again and again. It underpins the evidence to develop some certainty, some level of confidence in the system. That's our role, as I see it. So together we can I'm very confident. Time is short. As you say, Christian, we don't have much time to get this. So look at, again, we'll thank the panel for the second time.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you, David Paul. After the break, we continue with the theme monitoring soil health. Coffee now, please.
One more short attention, 30 seconds. Yesterday, we still are missing 2 audio guides. So if someone still have 2 small yellow boxes, so please return me. And we found 2 jackets on train, 1 brown and 1 black. So if somebody missed, they are at the registration desk.